Ignorance management. When Buckminster Fuller's famous operating manual for Spaceship Earth originally appeared in 1968, he boldly assumed, indeed in a utopian manner, that the time had come for social systems to transfer expert control from politicians and financiers to designers, engineers and artists. This assumption was based on a diagnosis that the members of the first group, like all quote-unquote specialists, only ever view reality through a small aperture, which does not allow them to see more than one section. However, due to their professions, members of the latter group develop holistic viewpoints and concern themselves with the entire panorama of reality. It was as though the romantic motto, "Power to the imagination," had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and been decoded on the other side as the slogan, "Power to design." The audacity of Buckminster Fuller's publication, which soon became a quote-unquote countercultural Bible, and later a Bible for those seeking quote-unquote alternatives, was not displayed by his contempt for the seemingly great and powerful of the world, whom he believes are, quote, now only ghostly prerogatives, end quote. It consisted in the truly prodigious redefinition of our home planet. From this critical moment on, the good old-fashioned Earth may no longer be envisaged in terms of natural dimensions, but is rather to be conceived of as a colossal work of art. It was no longer a foundation, but instead a construct. It was no longer a basis, but instead a vessel. It is a testimony to the prodigiousness as well as the irresistibility of Buckminster Fuller's metaphor that in less than half a century it has seeped into our collective consciousness. At the same time, it is indicative of the acute peril on board the spaceship Earth, that it brooks no escape into poetic flights of fancy, for lack of more precise concepts, as evidenced by the numerous, though admittedly unsuccessful, quote-unquote summits on climate change. Metaphor here represents the higher form of the concept. Its truth is revealed in the pertinence of its implications for the real situation. If the Earth is a spaceship, then its crew must in fact have a vital interest in the maintenance of livable relations within the interior of the vessel. In this regard, astronautical engineers speak of the life support system, LSS, that controls the biosphere mimetic constants on board space stations. The first criterion of the new art of piloting, that is to be posited for the integral spaceship, is thus atmospheric management. We should bear in mind that, in this vehicle, no oxygen masks will fall from the cabin ceiling in the quote-unquote unlikely event of the loss of cabin pressurization. It would also be absurd to claim that floor path illumination would guide us to the emergency exits. Spaceship Earth does not have any exits, neither for emergencies nor for normal situations. And with regard to floor path illumination, what else is it other than mild hypnosis for passengers suffering from aerophobia? The anxiety of the passengers on board the Spaceship Earth must be genuinely alleviated. Treating them requires revolutionary cognitive and technical procedures. Buckminster Fuller has clearly identified the most important condition for the human stay on board the Spaceship Earth. The passengers have not been provided with an operating manual, presumably because they are supposed to get to the bottom of things on their own. In fact, as far as we know, the Earth has been inhabited by human beings and their ancestors for almost 2 million years, without their, quote, ever knowing that they were on board a ship, end quote. In other words, in the past, human beings were quite ignorant as they navigated, since the system was designed to bear a high degree of human disorientation. Yet, to the extent that the passengers begin to get to the bottom of the situation and seize power over their environment by means of technology, the system's original indulgence of ignorance plummets, until it reaches the point where certain kinds of ignorant behaviour are no longer acceptable for the passengers' stay on board. Human being in the world, of which 20th century philosophy spoke, is thus revealed as being on board, a cosmic vessel that is susceptible to failure. Some time ago I suggested the concept of monogeism to characterise the human being's appropriate cognitive relation to this vessel, a term that designates the minimum, as it were, of a non-ignorant contemporary relation to the paramount importance of the earth. It likewise forms the axiom for a political ontology of nature. Viewed from today's perspective, the history of planetary thought turns out to be a final cognitive and pragmatic experiment, during which the truth of the global situation must be brought to light. Anyone on board the spaceship with the courage to use his or her own mind must sooner or later account for the fact that we must teach ourselves how to travel in space. The true conception of the conditio humana is thus: life and death autodidacticism. An autodidact is someone who must learn crucial lessons without a teacher. I would like to add that merely falling back on religious traditions in these matters will not help us, because the so-called world religions are without exception bound to the pre-astronautical understanding of the world. Even Jesus, with his ascent to heaven, was unable to contribute anything worth mentioning to the operating manual of Spaceship Earth. There is a claim about the relation of being and knowing that is associated with these reflections. Traditional knowledge essentially stood at a slight distance behind reality. Indeed, we could say that it arrived late, on principle. In light of this, and in regard to future problems, the question arises as to whether knowing will always come too late, due to its habitual tardiness. Fortunately, we are in the position to be able to answer this question in the negative. There is a kind of prognostic intelligence. Prognostic? That proves itself precisely in the gap between late and too late. I hope to forcefully articulate this intelligence here today. While most human learning to this point has followed the rule according to which we only, quote, learn from our mistakes, end quote, prognostic intelligence must wish to learn before the mistake has happened, a novelty in the history of didactics. In order to achieve a deeper understanding of such learning processes, a critique of prophetic reason is necessary. Such a critique must not let itself be daunted by the basal paradox of doomsday prophetism, that, were it successful, it would seem ex post like an unnecessary alarm, since what the prophet warned us will not come to pass, precisely because of his intervention. Outlines of such a critique were presented by Jean-Pierre Dupuy in his 2004 study, Pour un catastrophisme éclair. According to Dupuy, only experienced apocalypticists can engage in a sensible politics for the future, because they are brave enough to consider even the worst as a real possibility. To figure things out today means, above all, to understand that the last century's kinetic expressionism must be radically modified if we remain unable to dispense with it. By kinetic expressionism, I mean modernity's mode of existence, which was primarily made possible by the ready availability of fossil fuel. Since these materials have become virtually ubiquitous around us, we have lived life as if Prometheus had stolen fire a second time. The significance of this becomes clear when we acknowledge that the second fire has long powered not merely our engines, but also blazes in our existential motivations, in our vital conceptions of freedom. We can no longer imagine a freedom that does not always include the freedom to rev our engines and accelerate, the freedom to move to the most distant destinations, the freedom to exaggerate, the freedom to waste, indeed, lastly, even the freedom to detonate explosives and destroy ourselves. We hear the voice of kinetic expressionism when the young Goethe writes in a Sturm und Drang letter to Lavater, quote, I am now entirely embarked upon the wave of the world, completely resolved to discover, to battle, to founder, or to spring into the air with all of my cargo. End quote. We hear it when Nietzsche explains in Ecce Homo, I am not a man, I am dynamite. And in practical terms, we see it at work when, during the final stage of his circumnavigation of the Earth, After running out of coal during the Atlantic Passage from New York back to England, Phileas Fogg, the hero of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, begins to rip the wooden frame of his own ship apart in order to feed the combustion chambers of its steam engines. With the ship of Phileas Fogg burning itself to fuel itself, Jules Verne discovered nothing less than a universal metaphor for the industrial age. It evokes a fatal self-referentiality of a serpent swallowing its own tail. We have to go back to the early Romantic poet Novalis and his insightful vision of the self-grinding mill to find a comparably potent image for the description of the current modus vivendi. Yet, kinetic expressionism already characterises the gesture with which Queen Elizabeth I of England, in the famous engraving from the 16th century, lays her sovereign hand on the globe, as if to show that a new era has now begun in which the rulers of the world were no longer content with their own lands, but wanted to extend their power to the ends of the earth. The principle of growth, essential to modern life, turns out to be nothing but kinetic expressionism in action.